Reflections. From Places to Non-Places. Excerpts from Non-Places. Introduction to an Anthropology of Supermodernity by Marc Auge. If a place can be defined as relational, historical, and concerned with identity, then a space, which cannot be defined as relational or historical or concerned with identity, will be a non-place. The hypothesis advanced here is that supermodernity produces non-places, meaning spaces which are not themselves anthropological places and which, unlike Baudelarian modernity, do not integrate the earlier places. Instead, these are listed, classified, promoted to the status of places of memory, and assigned to a circumscribed and specific position. A world where people are born in the clinic and die in the hospital, where transit points and temporary abodes are proliferating under luxurious or inhuman conditions, hotel chains and squats, holiday clubs and refugee camps, shanty towns threatened with demolition or doomed to festering longevity, where a dense network of means of transport, which are also inhabited spaces, is developing, where the habitat of supermarkets, slot machines, and credit cards communicates worthlessly through gestures with an abstract, unmediated commerce, a world thus surrendered to solitary individuality, to the fleeting, the temporary and ephemeral, offers the anthropologist and others a new object, whose unprecedented dimensions might usefully be measured before we start wondering to what sort of gaze it may be amenable. We should add that the same things apply to the non-place as to the place. It never exists in pure form. Places reconstitute themselves in it. Relations are restored and resumed in it. The millennial ruses of the inventions of the everyday and the arts of doing, so subtly analyzed by Michel Descerteaux, can clear a path there and deploy their strategies. Place and non-place are rather like opposed polarities. The first is never completely erased, the second never totally completed. They are like palimpsests on which the scrambled game of identity and relations is ceaselessly rewritten. But non-places are the real measure of our time, one that could be quantified with the aid of a few conversions between area, volume, and distance, by totaling all the air, rail, and motorway routes, the mobile cabins called means of transport, aircraft, trains, and road vehicles, the airports and railway stations, hotel chains, leisure parks, large retail outlets, and finally the complex skein of cable and wireless networks that mobilize extraterrestrial space for the purposes of a communication so particular that it often puts the individual in contact only with another image of himself. The distinction between places and non-places derives from the opposition between place and space. An essential preliminary here is the analysis of the notions of place and space suggested by Michel Descerteaux. He himself does not oppose place and space in the way that place is opposed to non-place. Space, for him, is a frequented place, an intersection of moving bodies. It is the pedestrians who transform a street, geometrically defined as a place by town planners, into a space. A few terminological definitions are needed at this point. Place, as defined here, is not quite the place Descerteaux opposes to space, in the same way that the geometrical figure is opposed to movement, the unspoken to the spoken word, or the inventory to the route. It is place in the established and symbolized sense, anthropological place. Naturally, this sense has to be put to work. The place has to come to life, and journeys have to be made. And there is nothing to forbid the use of the word space to describe this movement. But that is not what we are saying here. we include in the notion of anthropological place the possibility of the journeys made in it, the discourses uttered in it, and the language characterizing it. And the notion of space, in the way it is used at present, to talk about the conquest of outer space, in terms which, for the time being, are more functional than lyrical, or to designate unnamed or hard-to-name places as well as possible, or with the minimum of inaccuracy, in the recent but already stereotyped language of travel, hotel and leisure institutions, leisure spaces, sports spaces, rather like rendezvous point, seems to apply usefully through the very fact of its lack of characterization to the non-symbolized surfaces of the planet. As a result, we might be tempted to contrast the symbolized space of place with the non-symbolized space of non-place. But this would hold us to the existing negative definition of non-places, which Michel de Certeau's analysis of the notion of space may help us to improve upon. The term space is more abstract in itself than the term place, whose usage at least refers to an event which has taken place, a myth said to have taken place, or a history, high places. It is applied in much the same way to an area, a distance between two things or points. A 2-meter space is left between the posts of a fence, or to a temporal expanse in the space of a week. It is thus eminently abstract, and it is significant that it should be in systematic, if still somewhat differentiated use today, in current speech, and in the specific language of various institutions representative of our time. The expression advertising space applies either to an area or to a length of time set aside for advertising in the various media. Buying space refers to all the operations carried out by an advertising agency in connection with advertising space. The craze for the word space, applied indiscriminately to auditoriums or meeting rooms, parks or gardens, aircraft seats, and cars, expresses not only the themes that haunt the contemporary era, advertising, image, leisure, freedom, travel, but also the abstraction that corrodes and threatens them, as if the consumers of contemporary space were invited first and foremost to treat themselves to words. Too frequent space, Michel de Certeau writes, is to repeat the gleeful and silent experience of infancy, to be other and go over to the other in a place. The gleeful and silent experience of infancy is that of the first journey, of birth as the primal experience of differentiation, of recognition of the self as self and as other, repeated later in the experiences of walking as the first use of space, and of the mirror as the first identification with the image of the self. All narrative goes back to infancy. When he uses the expression space narratives, de Certeau means both the narratives that transverse, and organize places. Every narrative is a journey narrative, and the place that is constituted by the writing of the narrative, reading, is the space produced by frequentation of the place constituted by a system of signs, a narrative. But the book is written before being read. It passes through different places before becoming one itself. Like the journey, the narrative that describes it transverses a number of places. This plurality of places, the demands it makes on the powers of observation and description, the impossibility of seeing everything or saying everything, and the resulting feeling of disorientation, but only a temporary one. This is me in front of the Parthenon, you will say later, forgetting that when the photo was taken, you were wondering what on earth you were doing there. Causes a break or discontinuity between the spectator, traveler, and the space of the landscape he is contemplating or rushing through. This prevents him from perceiving it as a place, from being fully present in it, even though he may try to fill the gap with comprehensive and detailed information out of guidebooks or journey narratives. When Michel de Certeau mentions non-place, it is to allude to a sort of negative quality of place, an absence of the place from itself, caused by the name it has been given. Proper names, he tells us, impose on the place an injunction coming from the other, a history. It is certainly true that someone who, in describing a route, states the names appearing along it, does not necessarily know much about the places. But can a name alone be sufficient to produce this erosion or non-place gouged out of a place by the law of other? Every itinerary, Michel de Certeau says, is in a sense diverted by names which give it meanings or directions that could not have been predicted in advance. And he adds, these names create non-place in the places, they turn them into passages. We could say, conversely, that the act of passing gives a particular status to place names, that the fault line resulting from the law of the other and causing a loss of focus is the horizon of every journey, accumulation of places, negation of place, and that the movement that shifts lines and transverses places is, by definition, creative of itineraries, that is, words and non-places. Space, as frequentation of places rather than a place, stems in effort from a double movement. The traveler's movement, of course, but also a parallel movement of the landscapes which he catches only in partial glimpses, a series of snapshots piled hurriedly into his memory and, literally, recomposed in the account he gives of them, the sequencing of slides in the commentary he imposes on his entourage when he returns. Travel, something the ethnologist mistrusts to the point of hatred, constructs a fictional relationship between gaze and landscape. And while we use the word space to describe the frequentation of places which specifically defines the journey, we should still remember that there are spaces in which the individual feels himself to be a spectator without paying much attention to the spectacle. As if the position of spectator were the essence of the spectacle, as if basically the spectator in the position of a spectator were his own spectacle.
So why are screens so pervasive in our analog life? We see screens from the moment we wake up to the moment we fall asleep. Why? I think it's because computers give us superpowers. Within the digital universe, we have the power to display space, and the power to displace time. It doesn't matter if you're using technology for entertainment, productivity, or communication. Think of it this way. Let's all go home tonight and watch our favorite show on television. This is theater, time and space displaced. As soon as I'm done with this TED Talk, I'm going to immediately call my lovely family in Seattle. That's displacement of space. Now, these are such great superpowers that we put up with the two-dimensional limitations of our current digital world. But what if we didn't have to? What if we could have these same digital powers in our world?
A lot of tourism leaflets suggest this deflection, this reversal of the gaze, by offering the would-be traveler advanced images of curious or contemplative faces, solitary or in groups, gazing across infinite oceans, scanning ranges of snow-capped mountains, or wondrous urban skylines. His own image, in a word, his anticipated image, which speaks only about him but carries another name, Tahiti, Alpe d'Huez, New York. The traveler's space may thus be the archetype of non-place. If we turn for a moment to the definition of modernity as the willed coexistence of two different worlds, Baudelairean modernity, we can see that the experience of non-place as a turning back on the self, a simultaneous distancing from the spectator and the spectacle. It is not always absent from it. Starobinsky, commenting on the first poem of the Tableau Parisiens, insists that it is the coexistence of two worlds, chimneys alongside spires, that makes the modern town, but that it also locates the particular position of the poet who, broadly speaking, wants to see things from high up and far away, and belongs neither to the universe of religion nor to that of labor. For Starobinsky, this position corresponds to the double aspect of modernity: loss of the subject among the crowd, or, inversely, absolute power claimed by the individual consciousness. But it can also be said that the position of the poet in the act of looking is a spectacle in itself. In this Parisian tableau, it is Baudelaire who occupies the central position, the one from which he sees the town, but which another self, at a distance, makes the object of a second sight. My chin cupped in both hands, high up in my garret, I shall see the workshops where they chatter and sing, the chimneys, the spires. Here, Baudelaire is not just referring to the necessary coexistence of ancient religion and new industry, or the absolute power of individual consciousness, but describing a very particular and modern form of solitude. The spelling out of a position, a posture, an attitude in the most physical and commonplace sense of the term, comes at the end of a movement that empties the landscape, and the gaze of which it is the object, of all content and all meaning, precisely because the gaze dissolves into the landscape and becomes the object of a secondary, unattributable gaze, the same one or another.
No one really knows what's going on.
How does that make you feel?
Well, it's not useful to dwell on how bad things are. My clients need me, so I have to stay ahead. Managing your attention effectively is key. The aim is to achieve a laser focus and find ways to work around the limitations of the human body. There isn't always time to eat, but there are so many innovative ways to fuel your body and mind. We're made of chemistry. Our thoughts and emotions are triggered by hormones and blood oxygen levels. It's something to remember when things feel overwhelming.
In my opinion, these shifts of gaze and plays of imagery, this emptying of the consciousness, can be caused, this time in systematic, generalized, and prosaic fashion, by the characteristic features of what I have proposed to call supermodernity. These subject the individual's consciousness to entirely new experiences and ordeals of solitude, directly linked with the appearance and proliferation of non-places.
Many people may have given up on the material world, opting for a purely digital existence. More and more humans may upload the contents of their minds into virtual environments where conscious beings can exist without physical constraints. Those that value their material lives may still surrender their corporeal bodies in favor of synthetic forms. Cyborgs composed of organic and inorganic parts may be more common than today's humans, representing the next stage of human evolution.
It is my view that Satan's arrogance and animosity towards humanity, who was created in the image of God, motivates malevolent intentions to dismantle this concept and mislead individuals into perceiving their physical form as non-place, a vacuous and lifeless receptacle lacking in essence and spirit. The phenomenon of persuading individuals to perceive themselves as not being created in the image of God, but rather as an entity separate from the divine, serves to elucidate the fundamental principles behind contemporary isms: relativism, atheism, nihilism, etc. With this misguided understanding, humanity then can be referred to as non-places. Humanness, as defined from a biblical worldview, can be defined as the fundamental nature and essence of a human person made in the image of God. Defined as a non-place, to be human is to be reduced to a deconstructed and inadequate entity. It is no more a space for the spirit, but rather a place where one can consume, extract, and diminish into a temporary vessel for economic profit, data consumption, uploaded consciousness, and irrelevant knowledge.